Most people lose the deal before they even finish talking, not because the solution was wrong, not because the price was too high, not because the competitor was better. They lose it because the person sitting across from them, the decision maker, couldn't follow what they were saying. The information was there, the features were listed, the slides were polished, but the client's brain hit a wall, too many options, too many details, too much abstraction. And when the human brain encounters that kind of cognitive overload, it doesn't say, "Let me think about it," out of genuine interest. It says, "Let me think about it," as a defense mechanism. That's the brain protecting itself from making a bad decision under confusion. And here's what nobody in sales training wants to admit. The quality of your solution is almost irrelevant if the way you present it creates friction in the other person's decision-making process. You could have the single best product in your market, the most elegant service package, the most competitive pricing, and still lose to someone whose offer is objectively worse, simply because that person made it easier for the client to say yes. This is the problem I want to dissect today, and I want to give you a framework, I call it DOME, that restructures how you present any solution, any proposal, any recommendation, so that it stops being an information dump and starts being a decision architecture. Something that guides the other person's brain toward clarity instead of away from it. But before I get into the framework itself, I need to explain why most solution presentations fail in the first place. Because if you don't understand the failure mechanism, you'll just apply the framework superficially, and it won't work. Here's what most people do when they present a solution, whether it's a B2B sales presentation, a consulting proposal, a freelance pitch, or even an internal recommendation to their boss. They think their job is to show how much they know. They think thoroughness equals professionalism. They think if they cover every angle, every feature, every possible objection preemptively, the client will be impressed by the depth and say yes. So they build a 40-slide deck, they walk through every capability, they list 17 benefits, they show 4 case studies, they include a comparison chart with 9 columns, and they feel good about it because it looks comprehensive. But here's what's actually happening on the other side of that table. The client's prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for executive decision-making, weighing trade-offs, evaluating options, is getting overwhelmed. The prefrontal cortex is powerful, but it has a bandwidth limit. Research in cognitive neuroscience, particularly work coming out of the tradition of cognitive load theory, has shown repeatedly that when you present someone with too many variables simultaneously, decision quality doesn't go up. It collapses, the brain starts pattern matching sloppily. It latches onto one random detail, maybe the price, maybe a feature that doesn't even matter, and uses that as a proxy for the whole decision. Or worse, it defers. It pushes the decision into the future. Let me discuss this with my team. Send me the proposal and I'll review it, which in most cases means you just lost the deal. This is not a willpower problem on the client's part. It's not that they're lazy or disengaged, it's architecture. You built a maze and then asked them to sprint through it. The structure of your presentation created the confusion, not the client's lack of interest. And the irony is painful. The harder you worked on that presentation, the more information you packed into it, the worse you made the client's experience. You thought you were being thorough. You were actually being an obstacle. Now contrast that with the deals that close smoothly. Think about the best buying experience you've ever had, not as a seller, but as a buyer. Someone who understood your problem, laid out a clear path, gave you just enough information to feel confident, and made the next step obvious. You probably said yes faster than you expected. You probably felt good about it. And if someone asked you afterward, you might have said, "It just made sense." That feeling of "it just made sense" is not magic. It's not charisma. It's not some gift that certain salespeople are born with. It's the result of how information was structured. It's design, and it's learnable. So here's the core judgment I want you to carry through the rest of this video. A great solution presentation is not about transmitting information. It is about reducing the cognitive cost of the decision. That's it. That's the entire game. Every slide, every sentence, every example you include should be evaluated against one question. Does this make it easier or harder for this person to decide? If it makes it harder, even if it's true, even if it's impressive, even if it took you 3 days to prepare, cut it. It's not serving the goal. This is what I mean when I say that real selling is not persuasion. It's not manipulation. And it's definitely not information overload dressed up as expertise. Real selling is helping someone else make a decision that's already in their interest by removing the barriers between them and that decision. You're not pushing, you're clearing the path, and this is where the DOME framework comes in. DOME stands for 4 things: diagnosis, outcome, mechanism, and evidence. These 4 elements, presented in this order, create a natural decision pathway in the listener's mind. They map onto how the brain actually processes consequential choices, not how we think it processes them, but how it actually does, according to what we know from neuroscience and decision psychology. Let me walk through each one, and I'm going to explain not just what each element is, but why it works at the neural level, how to execute it in practice, and where most people get it wrong. The first element is diagnosis. Before you present any solution, you must demonstrate that you understand the problem, not your version of the problem, but the client's lived experience of the problem. This sounds obvious. Everyone in sales has heard understand the customer's pain, but most people do it wrong in a very specific way. They diagnose the problem in their own language, using their own framework, filtered through their own expertise. They say things like, based on our analysis, your customer acquisition cost is 37% above industry benchmark, and your lead-to-close ratio suggests pipeline inefficiency in the middle funnel. And technically that might be correct, but it's not a diagnosis, it's an audit report. A diagnosis is when the other person hears what you say and feels recognized. Not just analyzed, recognized. There's a massive difference. Here's why this matters neurologically. When someone hears their own experience articulated accurately, not in jargon, but in the language they use internally, the way they describe it to a friend over dinner, something specific happens in the brain. The mirror neuron system activates. These are neurons that fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing or describing that same action. They're the neural basis of empathy, of feeling understood. When your diagnosis triggers the mirror neuron system, the client's brain shifts from evaluation mode to collaboration mode. They stop assessing you and start working with you. The defensive wall drops. And that shift from "is this person credible" to "this person gets it" is the most important transition in any sales conversation. If you don't achieve it, everything that follows is uphill. So how do you do this in practice? You use their language, not yours. If the client said in a previous conversation, "We're bleeding money on campaigns that don't convert," you don't reframe that as suboptimal ROAS across digital channels. You say, "You mentioned you're bleeding money on campaigns that don't convert. Let me show you exactly where the bleeding is happening and why." You reflect their words back. You anchor the diagnosis in their emotional reality, not your analytical framework. And here's where most people get this wrong. They rush past diagnosis to get to the solution. They treat it as a formality, a quick, "so here's your problem," before the real show begins. But the diagnosis is not the opening act. It's the foundation. If the client doesn't feel deeply understood in the first 2 minutes, they will not trust your solution for the next 20. You can have the best solution in the world and it won't matter, because the brain will not accept a solution from someone it doesn't believe understands the problem. Charlie Munger had a principle he applied relentlessly. Before you try to solve anything, make sure you actually understand the problem as it exists, not as you wish it existed. He called this avoiding the tendency to torture reality to fit your model. Most presenters do exactly that. They torture the client's reality to fit their product, and the client can feel it, maybe not consciously, but the brain registers incongruence and it responds with resistance. So the first element of DOME, diagnosis, is not about being right. It's about making the other person feel seen. Get that right and you've earned permission to continue. The second element is outcome. After the diagnosis, most people jump straight to features. Here's what our platform does. Here's our process. Here's our technology. This is wrong, not morally wrong, structurally wrong. It violates how the brain sequences decisions. Before a person can evaluate a solution, they need to see where it leads. They need a picture of the destination. Not a vague one, "We'll help you grow," but a specific, concrete, tangible outcome that they can visualize. This is where the neuroscience of the dopamine prediction system becomes relevant. Your brain's dopamine circuits don't just respond to rewards. They respond to the anticipation of rewards. When you describe a clear, believable, desirable outcome, you activate the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, the same circuitry involved in motivation, desire, and forward-oriented behavior. The brain starts leaning toward the future you've painted. It starts wanting that future, and once wanting is activated, the brain becomes significantly more receptive to hearing how to get there. And this is critical, the outcome has to be believable. If you oversell, if you paint a picture that feels like fantasy, the prefrontal cortex kicks in and shuts it down. The brain's BS detector is exquisitely tuned. So the outcome needs to be specific enough to be visualized and modest enough to be credible. Not "we'll transform your entire business." Instead, within 90 days, your sales team will spend 40% less time on unqualified leads, and your pipeline will reflect only opportunities with genuine buying intent. That means your closers are actually closing instead of chasing. See the difference? One is a slogan, the other is a picture. The brain can see the second one. It can feel what that would be like, the relief, the efficiency, the clarity. And that feeling is what creates forward momentum in the decision. Now, there's a subtlety here that I want to flag because it connects to a deeper principle. Naval has talked about the importance of specific knowledge, the kind of knowledge that can't be taught in a classroom, that comes from your unique experience and pattern recognition. When you describe the outcome in a DOME presentation, you're demonstrating specific knowledge. You're showing that you've been in this situation before, you know what good looks like on the other side, and you can describe it with precision. That's not something a generic competitor can replicate. It's your edge. And this is where the concept of what I'd call attraction through clarity comes in. There's a popular idea in personal development that you attract what you focus on. Strip away the mystical language, and there's a real mechanism underneath. Your reticular activating system, the RAS, filters the massive amount of sensory data hitting your brain every second and highlights what's relevant to your current goals and focus. When you present a clear outcome to a client, you're essentially programming their RAS. You're giving their brain a filter. This is what matters. This is what we are solving for. Once that filter is active, every subsequent thing you say gets evaluated against it. The client starts connecting your solution to their own situations, their own teams, their own numbers. They start doing the selling for you internally because you gave their brain a target to orient around. So the outcome element is not just nice to have, it's the engine. It creates desire, it establishes relevance, and it gives the brain a framework for evaluating everything that comes next. The third element is mechanism. This is where you explain how the solution actually works. And this is where most B2B sales presentations go off a cliff. Here's what usually happens. The presenter, excited to show the product or service, dumps everything, every feature, every integration, every module, every workflow. They think more detail equals more confidence, but it doesn't. More detail beyond a certain threshold equals more confusion, and confusion equals delay, deferral, or death of the deal. The mechanism section of a dome presentation has one job. Explain enough for the client to believe the outcome is achievable, and not one sentence more. Think about it like this. When you take a flight from New York to London, you don't need to understand turbofan engine thermodynamics. You need to know that the airline is reputable, the plane is maintained, and the flight path makes sense. You need just enough mechanism to believe you'll arrive. If the pilot came on the intercom and started explaining combustion chamber pressure ratios, you wouldn't feel more confident. You'd feel anxious. Same principle in solution presentations. The client doesn't need to understand every back-end process. They need to understand the logic of how you get from their current problem to the outcome you promised. And that logic needs to be simple. 3 steps, maybe 4, rarely more. Here's where the principle of deliberate practice from the research of Anders Ericsson applies to you as a presenter. Most people never practice simplifying their mechanism explanation. They practice adding to it. Every time they present, they think of another detail to include, another edge case to address, another feature to mention. They get better at being comprehensive. They never get better at being clear. Deliberate practice for mechanism presentation means this. Take your current explanation and cut it in half, then present it. See if the client understands. If they do, cut it in half again. Keep going until you hit the minimum viable explanation, the fewest words and steps needed for the client to believe the outcome is reachable. That's your mechanism. Everything else is noise. And I want to connect this to a broader principle from Munger's thinking, the idea of inversion. Instead of asking, what should I include in my presentation? Ask, what would make this presentation fail? And one of the top answers is including too much. Munger was famous for saying that knowing what to avoid is more valuable than knowing what to do. In the context of presenting solutions, knowing what to leave out is more important than knowing what to put in. Let me give you a practical technique. When you're explaining your mechanism, use what I call the therefore chain. Each step should connect to the next with a therefore. We start by auditing your current pipeline. Therefore, we identify where qualified leads are dropping off. We then restructure your scoring criteria. Therefore, your sales team only engages with leads that match your ideal profile. Therefore, within 60 days, your reps spend their time on conversations that actually close. Each therefore is a logical link. If you can't connect a step with therefore, it's either out of order, irrelevant, or too detailed. Cut it. The therefore chain does something specific in the brain. It activates sequential processing in the prefrontal cortex, the same type of processing the brain uses when it plans, strategizes, or evaluates cause and effect. By structuring your mechanism as a causal chain, you're aligning your presentation with the brain's natural planning architecture. The client doesn't have to work to follow you. The structure does the work. The fourth element is evidence. You've diagnosed the problem. You've painted the outcome. You've explained the mechanism. Now the client's brain asks one final question, but how do I know this will actually work? This is the trust gate. And most people try to pass through it by throwing volume at it. 10 testimonials, 8 case studies, a wall of logos, a spreadsheet of ROI numbers. Again, more is not better. Precision is better. The most effective evidence in a dome presentation has 3 qualities. First, it's relevant. It comes from a situation similar to the client's. Not a different industry, not a different company size, not a different market. Similar. The brain evaluates evidence through analogy, and the analogy has to feel close. Second, it's specific. Not we helped a company increase revenue. Instead, we worked with a mid-market logistics firm in Germany that was losing 22% of qualified leads at the proposal stage. Within 4 months, that number dropped to 9%, and their average deal size increased by 15% because their proposals were structured differently. Specificity triggers credibility in the brain because vagueness is a signal of deception. The more specific you are, the more the prefrontal cortex relaxes its skepticism filters. Third, and this is often missed, the evidence addresses the client's specific objection, not a generic one. If you did the diagnosis right, you know what this client is worried about. Maybe it's implementation time. Maybe it's team adoption. Maybe it's whether it works with their existing tech stack. Your evidence should directly answer the concern you know they have, even if they haven't voiced it yet. This connects to a principle from the Talmudic business tradition, the concept of establishing trust through demonstrated reliability, not through promises. In the Talmud, a merchant's word is binding not because of a contract, but because of a track record. Contracts formalize trust, they don't create it. Similarly, your evidence section doesn't create trust in your solution. It formalizes the trust you've been building since the diagnosis. If you did the first 3 elements well, the evidence is confirmation. If you did them poorly, no amount of evidence will save you. And there's one more thing about evidence that most people miss. The way you present evidence matters as much as the evidence itself. If you say, "Here are our case studies," and hand over a document, you've just abdicated the narrative. You've given the client raw data and asked their brain to do the synthesis. Instead, tell the story. When we first met the team at that logistics firm, they said almost exactly what you said in our first call. "We know our solution is good, but we keep losing deals at the proposal stage. Here's what we found, here's what we changed, and here's what happened." That narrative structure, situation, intervention, result, maps onto the brain's story processing architecture. Humans don't evaluate evidence as data. They evaluate evidence as story. If the story is coherent and specific, the brain accepts it. If it's a data dump, the brain defers. Now I want to zoom out and talk about why DOME works as a sequence, not just as a set of elements. Because you might be thinking, okay, diagnosis, outcome, mechanism, and evidence, I can include all 4 in my next presentation. And you'd be right, but only if you maintain the order. The order is not arbitrary. It follows the brain's natural decision sequence. First, the brain needs to feel understood. That's survival wiring. Before we cooperate with anyone, we need to know they see our reality. Diagnosis satisfies that. Second, once we feel understood, the brain asks, is there something better than my current situation? Outcome answers that. It creates desire and direction. Third, once we want the outcome, the brain asks, is there a credible path from here to there? Mechanism answers that. It creates plausibility. Fourth, once the path seems plausible, the brain asks, has this actually worked before? Evidence answers that. It creates confidence. If you scramble the order, if you lead with evidence, or start with mechanism, or open with the outcome before diagnosing, the brain's questions don't get answered in sequence. And unanswered questions create anxiety. Anxiety creates resistance. Resistance creates objections. Objections create delays. Delays kill deals. This is the same principle that underlies what Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi described in his work on flow and creativity. Flow, that state of complete absorption where performance peaks, doesn't happen when the task is chaotic. It happens when there's a clear goal, immediate feedback, and a challenge that's matched to skill level. A DOME presentation creates a kind of cognitive flow for the client. Each element answers the question that the previous element raised. The client is never confused about where they are in the conversation. They're never wondering, why is this person telling me this? Every piece of information arrives at the moment the brain is ready to receive it. That's not just good sales technique. That's design. That's architecture. Let me now give you a concrete scenario so you can see how this plays out in practice. Assume you run a consulting firm that helps mid-market SaaS companies improve their sales close rates. You're meeting with the VP of sales at a company that does about 40 million in annual revenue. They agreed to the meeting because their close rate dropped from 28% to 19% over the past 2 quarters, and they don't know why. Here's how most consultants would present their solution. They'd open with a company overview slide. About us, founded in 2018, served over 200 clients, offices in 3 cities. Then they'd show a methodology slide with a circular diagram and 6 interconnected bubbles. Then they'd walk through their platform, their analytics dashboard, their coaching modules. Then they'd show 5 case studies, then a pricing slide. The VP of sales would nod politely, ask a few questions about pricing, say, "Let me share this with my team," and never respond to your follow-up email. Now here's the same meeting using Dome. You start with diagnosis. You say, "When we spoke last week, you mentioned something that stuck with me. You said your reps are having great first conversations, but deals are dying in the middle, somewhere between the second call and the proposal. You said it feels like momentum just evaporates. We looked at the data you shared, and here's what we see. Your pipeline is actually healthy at the top. You're generating enough qualified conversations. But between stage 2 and stage 3, you're losing 41% of deals. And the ones that survive take, on average, 23 days longer to close than they did last year. That's not a lead gen problem. That's a middle-of-funnel problem. And in our experience, middle-of-funnel decay almost always comes down to one thing. The buyer doesn't know what the next step is. Your team is great at opening. They're struggling at advancing. Notice what just happened. You didn't talk about yourself. You reflected the client's experience back to them in their language, with their numbers anchored in what they told you. The mirror neuron system fires. The VP leans forward. You've earned the right to continue. Now you move to outcome. You say, "Here's what this looks like when it's fixed." Your reps aren't just having good first calls, they're creating a clear decision path for the buyer at every stage. Stage 2 to stage 3 conversion goes from 59% back up to 75% or higher. Your average deal cycle drops by at least 2 weeks. And your close rate climbs back above 25%, not by generating more pipeline, but by stopping the leakage in the pipeline you already have. That means your existing team, with your existing leads, closes more revenue without adding headcount. The VP can see this. They can picture what that would feel like on a Monday morning sales stand-up. You activated the dopamine prediction circuit. They want this future. Now mechanism. Here's how we do it. 3 steps. First, we audit your current deal stages and map exactly where and why buyers are stalling. We look at your actual conversations, not just your CRM data, because CRM data tells you what happened, conversations tell you why. Second, based on that audit, we build a custom next step architecture for your sales process, a set of clear, buyer-friendly transitions for every stage. Your reps learn how to end every interaction with a concrete, low-friction next commitment from the buyer. Third, we run a 6-week live coaching sprint where we sit in on real calls, give immediate feedback, and refine the system until it's natural. Therefore, your reps aren't memorizing scripts, they're building a skill. And that skill stays even after we're gone. 3 steps, each one connected by therefore. No feature dump, no dashboard screenshots, just a clear cause and effect chain. The VP's prefrontal cortex can follow it without strain. Now evidence. Let me tell you about a company that was in almost exactly your position. A SaaS firm doing about 45 million, similar deal complexity, similar sales team size. Their close rate had dropped from 30% to 21% over 3 quarters. Their VP of sales, and I'm quoting him, said, "I don't understand it. We haven't changed anything." That was the problem. They hadn't changed anything, but their buyers had. Buyers were doing more research, involving more stakeholders, needing clearer justification. We ran the same process I just described. Within 8 weeks, their stage 2 to 3 conversion improved by 18 points. Within 4 months, their close rate was at 27%. The VP told me something I think is relevant to you. The biggest change wasn't a new tool or a new script. It was that our reps started thinking about what the buyer needs to decide next, instead of what we want to present next. That's the shift we create. One story, relevant, specific, addressing the exact concern this VP has, and told as a narrative, not a data slide. That's Dome in action. The entire presentation might take 15 minutes, and it works not because it's a trick. It works because it respects how the human brain actually processes decisions. You're not persuading, you're clearing the path. Now let me address where this goes wrong, because frameworks are only useful if you know their failure modes. Failure mode number 1, fake diagnosis. You didn't actually listen in the discovery call, you're guessing at the problem. You're using generic language. The client senses it immediately, and everything that follows is built on sand. The fix: never present a solution until you've had at least one real conversation where you listened more than you talked. If you can't quote the client's own words back to them, you haven't diagnosed yet. Failure mode number 2, outcome inflation. You describe a future that's so rosy the client's skepticism alarms go off. We'll double your revenue in 6 months. Even if it's possible, it sounds like a scam. The fix: under-promise on the headline, over-deliver on the specifics. We won't double your revenue. What we will do is stop the 41% pipeline leakage in your middle funnel. Let the math tell you what that's worth. Failure mode number 3, mechanism bloat. You know your solution so well that you can't resist explaining every detail. You go from 3 steps to 8. You add sub-steps. You mention your proprietary algorithm. You lose the client in technical weeds. The fix: apply the rule of 3. If you can't explain your mechanism in 3 steps or fewer, you haven't simplified enough. And simplification is not dumbing down, it's elevation. It's finding the level of abstraction that matches the client's decision-making needs, not your engineering pride. Failure mode number 4, irrelevant evidence. You show a case study from a Fortune 500 company when you're talking to a 50-person startup. Or you show a consumer brand case study when you're pitching a B2B infrastructure company. The client can't see themselves in your evidence. The fix: always ask yourself before presenting evidence, would this client see their own situation in this story? If the answer is no, pick a different story. It's better to have one perfectly relevant example than 10 impressive but irrelevant ones. Now I want to go one level deeper, because I think there's a meta lesson inside Dome that goes beyond sales presentations. And it connects to something I think about a lot: the idea that sales is not a department, it's not a function. It's a life skill. Everyone is selling, all the time. You're selling when you propose a new idea to your boss. You're selling when you ask someone to collaborate on a project. You're selling when you explain to your partner why you should move to a different city. You're selling when you write a job application, when you pitch an investor, when you try to get your teenager to understand why homework matters. And in every single one of those situations, the same principle applies. The quality of your idea matters far less than the clarity with which you present it, because ideas don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in other people's minds, and other people's minds have limited bandwidth, emotional filters, competing priorities, and a deep, neurological need to feel understood before they'll agree to anything. Dome is not a sales hack, it's a communication architecture, and if you internalize it, if you practice it until it becomes how you naturally structure any consequential conversation, you will find that doors open more easily. Not because you've become more manipulative, but because you've become more clear. And clarity is the most underrated form of respect. When you're clear, you're saying to the other person, I value your time, I value your cognitive bandwidth. I'm not going to waste either. I've done the work to make this easy for you to evaluate. That's what Naval means when he talks about leverage. Not just financial leverage or code leverage, but communication leverage. The ability to take a complex idea and make it land in someone else's mind with minimal distortion, that's a superpower. And it compounds. Every clear presentation you give builds your reputation for clarity. People start referring to you not because you're the cheapest or the flashiest, but because you're the person who makes things make sense. That referral network built on clarity is an asset that pays dividends for decades. Let me connect this to one more principle, because I think it's important, and it often gets missed in discussions about selling and presenting. There's a concept in the Talmudic tradition of business ethics that says, a transaction is only valid if both parties understand and benefit. It's not enough for one side to win. If the buyer is confused but signs anyway, that's not a good deal, it's a debt. Eventually, the confusion surfaces as buyer's remorse, as a failed implementation, as a client who never renews, as a referral that never comes. So presenting clearly isn't just good technique, it's good ethics. You owe it to the person across from you to make sure they understand what they're agreeing to. If they can't follow your presentation, that's your failure, not theirs. And this principle also protects you. Because when a client truly understands what they're buying, when the diagnosis felt right, the outcome felt real, the mechanism felt logical, and the evidence felt relevant, they don't just sign. They commit, they implement. They champion your solution internally. They become your advocate. The deal doesn't end at the signature. It begins there. And the quality of everything that follows, the implementation, the relationship, the renewal, the referral, depends on the quality of understanding that was established during the presentation. So here's what I want you to do this week. And I mean this week, not someday, not when I have time. This week, take your most important upcoming conversation, whether it's a B2B sales presentation, a proposal, a pitch, a negotiation, or even just a difficult conversation where you need someone to agree to something. And restructure it using DOME. Step 1, write down the diagnosis. Not your diagnosis, the client's experience of the problem. Use their words. If you don't have their words yet, go get them. Have a conversation. Ask questions. Listen. Step 2, write down the outcome. Not your service description. The result, what their world looks like after the problem is solved. Make it specific enough to visualize and modest enough to believe. Step 3. Write down the mechanism in 3 steps or fewer. Use the therefore chain. If a step doesn't connect to the next one with therefore, cut it or restructure. Step 4. Choose one piece of evidence. 1. Make sure it's from a situation similar to the client's. Make sure you can tell it as a story, not recite it as data. Then practice it out loud, not in your head, out loud. Because the gap between knowing a framework and executing it under pressure is enormous. That gap is where most knowledge dies. Deliberate practice, speaking the words, hearing how they sound, adjusting the pacing, simplifying the language, is what turns the framework from a concept into a capability. And here's one more thing. After your next presentation, ask the person you presented to, was there any point where you felt confused or unsure about what I was saying? That question takes courage. But the answer is the most valuable feedback you will ever receive, because confusion is the enemy, and you can't fight an enemy you can't see. Let me leave you with this. The world is full of brilliant people with excellent solutions who can't get anyone to say yes. And the world is full of average people with decent solutions who close deal after deal. The difference is rarely the solution. It's almost always the presentation, not the polish, not the slides, not the charisma, the structure, how clearly the problem was named, how vividly the outcome was painted, how simply the mechanism was explained, how precisely the evidence addressed the real concern. Wealth, real, sustainable wealth, is not a measure of how much you know. It's a measure of how effectively you can put what you know into action, into exchange, into the world. Knowledge that stays in your head is a hobby. Knowledge that moves through clear communication into other people's decisions, that's an asset. Dome isn't magic, it's architecture. Build it once, practice it until it's instinct, and you'll find that the problem was never your solution. It was always the path you built, or failed to build, between your solution and someone else's yes. If you found value in this, share it with someone who's losing deals they shouldn't be losing. And leave a comment. I read every one. Comment prompt for engagement. Think about the last deal you lost, or the last time someone said, "Let me think about it." Looking back, which part of Dome was missing? Did you skip the diagnosis, inflate the outcome, overcomplicate the mechanism, or use the wrong evidence? Drop your answer below.